Hello and welcome to another episode of Zilog and Moto, the channel where your host, Moi, has a bit of a crazy concept: to collect and review complete copies of every English language game for the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And note, I said English language there, so that means European and Brazilian releases as well. Is a complete collection of all these titles realistic in 2022 and beyond, just due to how crazy the market has gotten and the extreme rarity of some of those titles, even in their home countries, much less the United States? Probably not, but hey, it's good to have goals, right? Plus, you never know when you're going to run into a shop and stumble into a hard-to-find complete title like Pele 2 here, only to get home and find out that it was bizarrely rehomed into a different case where the manual didn't fit anymore and that someone had duct taped a bent up paperclip underneath the inner cover to have it better hold something in place. Yeah, it was really weird. Thankfully, getting a proper case for it isn't that hard, so that's on the way to complete that copy. You know, that's the one thing we're losing to history with switching to digital releases, is these strange copies of games that clearly came from a mom and pop rental store in Saginaw, Michigan, that actually was previously the inventory of a separate store in Upper Sandusky, Ohio, and the resulting case is sun-bleached all to hell after having sat untouched in the front window for 5 years. Young gamers just don't know what you're missing. Now, normally at this point in the video, and at the end, I'd mention something about if you like the video to consider liking and subscribing and all that, and I guess I technically just did, but going forward, I'll only be doing that during the closing section. There was a thread about it on Twitter last week, and honestly, I agreed with the poster about not putting that stuff before the content. Honestly, I don't love doing it at all, but unfortunately, that's just the way the algorithm is played, and I would like for as many people to see these videos as possible, just to get the word out there for some of these lesser known games that a player in 2022 may not have heard of before. And for this week's game, that gamer in question was actually me before I stumbled onto needing it for the collection. And that game is 1992's Pro Quarterback from Tradewest. Yes, the same Tradewest that brought you ports of much more famous games like Double Dragon and Iron Man Ivan Stewart's Off-Road Racing. And in yet another thing I learned in doing this review, technically Pro Quarterback could be considered a port of an arcade game as well. If you kind of closed one eye and squinted really hard anyway. Pro Quarterback's history actually goes back to an arcade machine called John Elway's Quarterback, or John Elway's Team Quarterback, or even just Quarterback if you're playing the version of the game before Leland Corporation got the John Elway license. If you're not familiar with that arcade machine, you still may be familiar with the port of the game to the NES using the John Elway's Quarterback name in 1989, which was advertised heavily in comic books at the time, which is how I came to know it, even though I never played it, that I remember anyway. Apparently, by 1992, Leland Corp and Tradewest had run out of ideas and decided they should create another football title for the current crop of 16-bit consoles. Yes, Pro Quarterback got a Super Nintendo release as well, but didn't have the cash to try and license the John Elway name again, so we get the blandly named Pro Quarterback. Did they manage to spend that money they saved on development and create a hidden gem? Or is there a reason I wasn't familiar with this game? I'll take a look, but first, that very green package.
And this is Pro Quarterback for the Genesis. This copy is in decent shape. There's a few marks here and there, and the hang tab has been cleanly removed from the top of the case, but for the most part, it's held up pretty well. I'm sure I could go find a more mint copy if I wanted to, and for not much money, as the average complete cost for Pro Quarterback is about $8 right now. But without spoiling too much, I have zero desire to do so this copy is plenty good enough for me. The first thing I noticed when looking at the cover is how insanely cheap the graphic design looks. They were apparently going for a look where the artwork was being laid on an extremely green background that was made to appear similar to a football field, with the various hashes and lines that go across. But in reality, this cover looks like a kindergartner's attempt at a game cover, with gluing pictures and graphics on top of a green sheet of construction paper. It just looks pathetically bad, and there's nothing on this front cover that makes me go, boy, I want to own and or rent that game. I mean, I suppose the picture with the blurred motion is kind of neat, but then why does the pro quarterback logo run off the edge? I just want to know who in marketing looked at this and was like, yeah, roll with that. For what it's worth, the Super Nintendo version looks just as generic, but it's a bit nicer due to focusing on that picture and eschewing all that green. Flipping over the back, and, well, it doesn't get any better, folks. Apparently TradeWest realized that any kind of dark text would be difficult to read on the green background, so they used white text, similar to what Sega did for their black covers. Oh, no, wait, they didn't do that at all. Instead, they were bound and determined to use black text, and combine that with not using a bold font. So they were left with no choice but to instead insert this large white box onto the, quote, field background, and how about throw a border around it too, just to make it even more disruptive. But then they didn't even extend the white box all the way up, so the headline and the top two screenshots stick out, all while still showing the goofy yard markers. And check out the very unofficial 1 or 2 player box down below that isn't remotely centered. Boy, this just screams quality. This whole package is a graphic design nightmare, and it might be the worst cover I've looked at so far while doing this channel, which is saying something considering I covered pro wrestling for the Master System in the first video. Trying to put the poor design aside for a minute, the actual content has got issues as well. The screenshot selection is okay as far as the content goes, but the quality isn't great, and the shot of the plays is super washed out for some reason, making the details hard to see. But somehow, just that one screenshot has the issue, none of the rest. Then there's the headline and the stinger, which read, "Warning, this game is too real," and it just doesn't get any more realistic. As you might have guessed based on the rest of the package, both of these statements are laughably untrue, and I'll delve more into that shortly. Opening up the box, and the manual is in near perfect condition, but for some reason the cartridge had a sticker placed on the label at some point. Oh well. The manual features plenty of pictures of the 3-button controller. No, seriously, we've got 13 pictures of the controller, with a brief respite toward the end, just to be followed by 2 final pictures of the controller in a quick reference section. I'm just not even sure what to say anymore. If you ignore the ridiculous design choices, the manual does do a competent job of explaining the game, so I guess that's nice. Let's go ahead and move on to the actual review. I can't stand to look at this package anymore. It's hurting my soul. As craptastic as I'm sure the game looks based on the packaging I've just discussed, I'm here to tell you in no uncertain terms, it gets worse. Much worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Have you ever played a game and immediately, as soon as you powered the game up, you knew it was a bad game? Like, I don't mean that you started the game and within the first 30 seconds or so of playing it, you knew it was going to be a shit show. No, what I mean is literally as soon as you turned on the console and the title screen was displayed, before you even pressed a button on the controller, you were saying to yourself, "Oh no." Well, if you haven't, consider yourself lucky, as this is somewhat rarefied air that I'm discussing when it comes to bad games. But this also means that you probably have never attempted to play Pro Quarterback. When booting up the game, the first screen you see is a pretty standard TradeWest Sports logo with references to Leland Corp in the background, probably about what most people would expect. But then the title screen hits, or maybe more accurately, thuds. The title screen is a digitized version of that super generic picture from the cover, which of course isn't that great to begin with, but then whatever process they used to digitize the picture just totally caused it to be blurry and foggy, losing most of its detail. In all seriousness, it may be the worst title screen I've seen since starting this channel. As soon as I saw it show up on the screen, it's hard to explain, but I just knew things were not getting any better. Once you get past the title screen, you get to the gameplay menu, which actually looks somewhat reminiscent of what you might have seen in an early Madden title, to the point where I'm almost sure that they, at very least, I'll say, drew inspiration from Madden in setting this up. It's from this screen that you start to get some of the evidence that there's something very, very wrong with this title. Some of the options look pretty normal, what you would expect in a sports title. There's options for quarter length, so you can choose how short or long you want to play for, and then there's options for what kind of field and or weather conditions you're going to be playing in. Good so far. There's also options to turn the music off and to choose whether a number that indicates which number player you are appears over your player's head. Both may be a little unnecessary, but still fine. But then there's the two options that start to set off alarm bells. The first is the option for the player setup if you're going to be playing one player, two players, or a team as head-to-head. Again, pretty straightforward, but something's missing. Normally when you set up your player situation, there's also an option that sets up what type of game it is. Is it a one-off exhibition? Is it a tournament? Is it a whole season, possibly? Well, there's a very good reason why there's not any selections for game mode in the main menu, and that's because there aren't any. Yes, you heard that right. Pro Quarterback consists of exactly one type of game mode, and that's a simple one-game exhibition. No playoffs, no season, no Pro Bowl. There's literally nothing here other than playing one-off games forever. I was pretty shocked to see that, as I'm having a hard time thinking of another 16-bit sports title with only one game mode. Maybe something like Arch Rivals, I guess, and I suppose Pro Quarterback technically being the descendant of an arcade machine, it kind of makes sense. But with only exhibitions being available, this is just the first in a series of things that make me highly question the "it just doesn't get any more realistic" tagline from the back of the case. I mentioned that there was two things in the game selection menu that immediately caused concern. Well, the other thing that stands out is the names of the teams for when you choose who is playing who. As you're probably not surprised to hear, Pro Quarterback has no kind of licensing or image rights associated with it. The previous games in the series were at least graced with the presence of John Elway, but Pro Quarterback not only lacks an individual naming license, it doesn't have any sort of NFL or NFL Players Association license, hence the generic picture on the cover. Now, I've played plenty of sports titles that don't have licensing, or that only have partial licensing, and usually this doesn't cause too much of an issue if the game is good. Of course, it's better to have real team names, logos, and players, as it helps you get into the game, but no one refused to play the original John Madden Football or NHL Hockey due to lack of licensing. However, when you're missing those things from the game, usually you replace them with things that make sense. For instance, in NHL PA Hockey 93, EA chose having real player names in the game over real teams, and as a result, you would have ended up with two teams named New York, one for the Rangers and one for the Islanders. However, EA recognized that this was confusing, and as a result, kept the Rangers as the New York team, but changed the Islanders to be Long Island. It's a small tweak, but it shows that EA actually cared about their presentation. The designers behind Pro Quarterback couldn't be even bothered to do that, apparently. The game features 26 teams that represent what the NFL looked like in 1992, with the teams even ordered and grouped together via their conference and division. That's all well and good, but how did Pro Quarterback handle the fact that in 1992, New York City and Los Angeles had two NFL teams? Did they come up with interesting names like Manhattan or Queens and Inglewood or Anaheim? No, they didn't. Instead, what we got was New York 1 and 2 and Los Angeles 1 and 2. I get that it's a small thing, but that's exactly it. This is a small thing. They literally were too lazy to come up with new labels for the teams, so we ended up with a scenario with literally Thing 1 and Thing 2. Let's get on to the game itself, and here's where I'm really going to start calling into question that "it just doesn't get any more realistic" tagline. Real football, as a rule, is an 11-on-11 sport. Yes, there's variations on that, but by and large, if you're playing by standard rules, you've got 11 players on offense and 11 on defense. Pro Quarterback does not. Instead, each team only has 9 players. Now, I ask you, wouldn't it be pretty easy to be more realistic simply by virtue of having the correct amount of players on the field? Now, for whatever reason, the John Elway series, as I'm going to call it for simplicity's sake, has always featured 9 players per team, and I suppose at least Pro Quarterback is consistent with the previous two titles, but I'm definitely throwing a penalty flag here. Beyond the number of players issue, the game more or less plays like a standard game of football, possibly with an arcadey slant, which makes sense given its heritage. And there are a few things that the game does that I like, such as allowing you to scan left and right of the field when you're at line, and choose who your primary target is going to be before you hike the ball. Also, if you prefer, you can swap the orientation of the play you choose from left to right, essentially doubling the number of plays at your disposal. Unfortunately, it's all downhill from there. And what I can only assume is part of their attempt at realism, the game apparently has injuries, or at least the announcer saying that there's been an injury after a play. However, they have no effect on the game, so I'm not exactly sure why they were included. The reason why they have no effect on the game is that the game has no individual base stats, meaning that every team plays exactly the same, with every player looking exactly the same, including their numbers, as everyone is number 88. I don't know about you, but a game that features 26 identical teams minus the uniforms doesn't exactly sound very realistic to me. Another thing that doesn't back up the game's realistic claims is its total lack of penalties. Yes, that's right, no penalties, not even offsides, as if you try to run up to the line early, you'll simply be held back by an invisible force field. This may sound like I'm beating a dead horse, because I am, but how can you legitimately try to pass a football game off as realistic and not have the potential for a single penalty? And to be perfectly clear, I don't even really care about whether the game has penalties or not, but it's the principle of it all. The game is needlessly sloppy in other areas as well. For instance, no matter where the ball is downed, it is always placed directly in the middle of the field rather than at the hash marks, which kills the need for that feature of flipping plays, as there will always be plenty of room on both sides of the ball. Sometimes the quarterback doesn't throw the ball when you hit B, and I have no idea what to attribute that to, but there's nothing more frustrating than taking a sack even though you know you got the ball off in time. Extra points are needlessly difficult to hit, and I believe I only made 2 the entire time I played the game. Meanwhile, the computer of course has no problem hitting them. And you can forget field goals. Just go for it on fourth. Speaking of field goals, after one is taken, the screen that shows the field goal status has a typo, with field goal all presented as one word. In yet another head-scratching, how did they get that wrong moment? And finally, the last odd gameplay quirk that I'll bring up is that during gameplay, nowhere does it tell you what quarter it is. Yes, again, it's a minor thing, and you'll probably always just know where you're at in the game, but it's a pretty bizarre scoring element to leave out. Now, that's all the ways in which the game simply plays like shit. But what about how it looks? Well, if you've been paying attention to the gameplay that's been running this whole time, you know. Basically, it lines up with the original title screen, looking just as bad when it's in motion. If you can even call it being in motion, as the animation for the game simply crawls and seems to run at just a few frames a second. It's probably a good thing the game only features 18 players on the field instead of 22, because I don't know if Pro Quarterback's amazingly poor programming could handle 4 more sprites. I understand it probably is not totally fair to compare Pro Quarterback to Madden or Joe Montana Football, but Trade West had to know this game was vastly inferior, and having said that, I don't understand how it got released in this condition. Even something simple like the audience in the stands is just random splashes of color, rather than appearing to look like people, something that even the original Great Soccer from 1985 on the Master System got right. As far as this game's sound goes, it fares a bit better than the graphics, but that's kind of like saying that gas station sushi is better than week-old tuna salad. The small bits of background music are fine, but you won't hear them much, which just leaves the sound effects for the game, and honestly, the sound effects might be the one thing they did right. Sure, they can be a bit rough in places, which I know is a result of the cramped 8 megabit cartridge, But the announcer does say a few things, and there's other appropriate noises like the quarterback calling out a cadence or the crunch of a tackle. But ultimately, the sound effects just serve as set dressing on the Titanic. Pro Quarterback simply doesn't need to exist. There's no one that's ever played Pro Quarterback, especially in a world that already had 2 releases in the John Madden Football and Joe Montana Football series, and was like, boy, I'm really glad John Elway Quarterback got a 16-bit sequel without John Elway. This isn't a diamond in the rough. Hell, it's not even coal in the rough, because at least coal you could burn for energy. As a result of just a litany of questionable decisions and apparent laziness, I have no choice but to award Pro Quarterback a total bomb rating. This game is simply a waste of everyone's time that's ever played it, a waste of money for everyone that's ever purchased or rented it, and absolutely no one should seek it out.
Okay, that was Pro Quarterback for the Genesis. Somehow I've managed to review 2 absolutely terrible sports games for the console this year, but honestly, as bad as Pro Quarterback is, if I had to choose to play it again or NBA All-Star Challenge, I'd probably go with Pro Quarterback, because at least it's not totally broken from a gameplay perspective. But that's literally the only reason, and I can't imagine giving it even one more second of my time, unless I was dared to on a charity stream or something. But even then, I can't imagine anyone wanting to watch that. Next week, the Genesis Marathon continues for one more week before switching consoles, and I think it's time to pull out a platformer, as I haven't featured one of those on the channel for a few months now. This is going to be a game that I've never played, and it's based on a cartoon that I only have vague memories of from 30 years ago. It is a Disney property though, so I'm hopeful it will be at least decent given Disney's pretty good track record on the Genesis. But I guess I'll just have to play it to find out. Now that we're at the end for another week, if you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.